The crowd surges forward, pressing tight against the marble columns of the forum. In the center, a young woman stumbles, dragged by soldiers with iron grips on her bound wrists. Her tunic has been torn in the struggle, her hair tangled and hanging across her face, streaked with dust and tears. She lifts her head once, just enough to see the mob that surrounds her, and the jeers crash down like stones. The stench is everywhere, sweat dripping from bodies packed shoulder to shoulder, sour wine on the breath of drunk men, and beneath it all the sickly smell of sewage seeping up from the city's drains. Rome has gathered not for law, but for spectacle. The woman is accused of betrayal, and though she might once have been a neighbor, a wife, a daughter, now she is nothing more than a canvas for punishment. An official steps forward and raises his hand, not to sentence her to crucifixion, the punishment foreigners know best, the one carved into Christian memory, but to something stranger, something designed not only to kill her, but to disgust the crowd and satisfy the perverted appetites of Roman elites. This was the hidden face of Rome. Marble temples rose above the city, law courts boasted of order, generals carved triumphs into history. But beneath the polish of empire, Rome's punishments were filthy, humiliating, revolting. They were not only about ending life. They were about stripping dignity from flesh, reducing human beings to objects of shame, forcing the crowd to see their deaths as both justice and warning. You may think you know Rome's cruelty. You may picture the cross. But crucifixion was only the surface. Do you know the punishment where criminals were sewn alive into sacks with animals, forced to claw and suffocate in the dark as dogs and snakes ripped at their skin? Do you know of the victims hurled into Rome's sewers, drowning not in water but in human waste, their bodies washed out into the sea like refuse? These punishments were not just about execution. They were about disgust, the spectacle of watching dignity rot away. They turned human suffering into a theater of filth, staged for crowds who laughed, gagged, and cheered while the condemned struggled to breathe. And across the next 8 practices, you will see how far Rome went. You will see bodies smashed on rocks and left to decay in the open. You will see prisoners forced to play roles in grotesque plays where myth and death blurred together. You will see sacks thrashing with animals, dung-smeared parades, and young girls sealed alive beneath the earth with only bread and a flickering lamp. But the final practice, the last and foulest punishment, was worse than all of them. It was Rome's ultimate erasure, so revolting that even hardened legionaries turned their faces away. It was not simply a death. It was a sentence to become filth itself, swallowed and lost, denied even the dignity of a corpse. Because in the end, Rome did not simply punish its enemies, it consumed them. It dragged them into filth, into humiliation, into rot. And centuries later, the stench of those punishments still lingers in history. Before diving into these forgotten stories of madness and cruelty, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. The climb began at dawn, when the shadows of the Capitoline Hill still stretched long across the forum. A prisoner, a young woman, condemned for betrayal, was dragged forward, wrists bound behind her back with coarse rope. Her tunic, once white, was ripped and caked with mud, exposing her body to the leers of the men pressing close to see. Soldiers flanked her on either side, forcing her toward the steep incline that wound its way up the Capitoline. The crowd followed. They jeered, spat, hurled curses that cut deeper than stones. Some threw rotten fruit, others chunks of bread grown soft with mold. The food slapped against her skin and slid to the ground, where dogs snatched it up, tails wagging at the promise of more flesh to come. The air was heavy, sweat from hundreds of bodies packed shoulder to shoulder, sour wine clinging to the mouths of men who had drunk since sunrise. and always the background reek of sewage drifting up from the Cloaca Maxima. Rome smelled like itself, glory on the surface, rot beneath. This was not a quiet affair. Rome did not execute traitors in silence, tucked away in hidden prisons. Rome made a spectacle of it. To hurl someone from the Tarpeian rock was to degrade them in front of the entire city, to strip them naked not just of clothing, but of dignity. It was theater, staged as much for the senators in their marble seats as for the plebeians pressed against the barriers. The climb itself was part of the punishment. The soldiers dragged her slowly, deliberately, scraping her bare feet against gravel, tearing her skin against the rough stones. She stumbled, fell, and was pulled upright again, her body sagging but forced forward like a puppet on strings. The screams of the mob rose and fell with each stumble, as though the suffering of the climb were an opening act in a performance meant to whet their appetites. At the summit, the prisoner was thrust down before the Tarpeian rock. The cliff jutted out over the city, its jagged edge glinting in the morning sunday. Below, the drop was sheer, the rocks waiting like teeth. An official read out the charges in a voice heavy with pomp, but the words were drowned by the crowd's roar. Few cared about guilt or innocence. What mattered was the fall. The soldiers stripped her last remaining garments, leaving her naked before the throng. Her body was smeared with dirt and bruises from the climb. But the jeering was not only about punishment. It was about humiliation. Senators leaned forward, eyes glinting, their mouths curling into cruel smiles. Equestrians elbowed one another, whispering jokes, pointing, laughing. The punishment was as much for their appetites as for the law. Rome's elites reveled in seeing a body, once chaste, once perhaps respected, reduced to nothing more than an object to be mocked, violated, and discarded. But it gets worse. She was dragged to the cliff's edge, her heels gouging furrows into the dirt. She screamed, pleaded, twisted in vain. The crowd leaned forward, savoring every moment of her desperation. For a breath, time held still. And then, release. Her body plummeted. The scream tore from her throat, then snapped shut with a crack of bone against stone. The sound echoed up the cliffside, a dull, sickening thud. Her limbs splayed, twisted at angles no body was meant to bend. Blood seeped into the rocks, dripping like a grotesque offering. The crowd gasped, then erupted. Some cheered, others gagged. A senator laughed aloud, slapping his knee. Boys scrambled to the base of the cliff, craning their necks for a closer look. Rome's appetite had been fed, not just with justice, but with disgust. But the show did not end with the fall. The body was left where it lay. No burial, no rites, no pyre. The condemned were denied the dignity of remembrance. Instead, they became carrion. Dogs slunk forward, their teeth tearing at soft flesh. Birds descended, beaks ripping strips from the corpse, carrying pieces into the sky. The stench grew unbearable as the sun rose higher, the heat swelling the body until it burst. Maggots seethed in the wounds, a living froth of decay. The Capitoline Hill became not a symbol of Rome's glory, but a stage of rot. This was Rome's irony. Senators clothed in spotless togas spoke of law and order, yet here was justice. A naked body hurled like garbage, left to rot in public view. Poets sang of Rome's eternal dignity, yet its punishments smeared the city with blood, excrement, and decay. Rome proclaimed itself the pinnacle of civilization, but it fed on humiliation and filth. And this was why the Tarpeian rock mattered. It was not only an execution ground, it was a reminder. To betray Rome was to be made into waste, to satisfy the appetites of those who ruled. The elites feasted not only on banquets of roasted meats, but on the suffering of flesh hurled from cliffs, broken and left for animals. For the crowd, it was entertainment. For the elites, it was reassurance. They laughed at the fallen because in laughing, they reminded themselves of their own safety, their own power. As long as others were hurled from cliffs, their own seats remained secure. But for the condemned, it was more than death. It was obliteration. Families were forbidden to retrieve the bodies. To be cast from the Tarpeian rock was to be denied memory itself. The victim became nothing but bones, gnawed and scattered, their name unspoken. And yet, for all its horror, the Tarpeian rock was quick. The fall lasted seconds. The bones cracked in an instant. Compared to what Rome devised for others, it was merciful, because not all victims were granted such a swift release. Some were made to die more slowly, suffocating, drowning, rotting in filth. Some were forced not into the open air, but into the sewers themselves, swallowed by darkness and stench. Rome's cruelty did not always end with blood on the rocks. Sometimes it ended with decay in the dark, where filth itself became the executioner. Picture this: a condemned prisoner dragged not toward a cliff or arena, but down into the bowels of the city. The Cloaca Maxima, Rome's great sewer, was a marvel of engineering, a tunnel carved through stone to drain the waste of an empire. To Roman poets, it was proof of civilization. To those chained inside it, it was hell. The air grew colder as the guards pushed the prisoner deeper, the torches sputtering against damp walls slick with slime. The smell hit like a hammer, the stench of human waste mixed with rotting food, dead animals, and stagnant water. Every breath was a gag. Rats skittered in the shadows, their wet fur brushing against ankles, their eyes flashing red in the torchlight. The prisoner was forced into the black heart of the sewer and shackled to the wall. The water, if it could be called water, lapped around their ankles, thick, brown, and bubbling. Within minutes, their skin began to burn. Ammonia rose in choking fumes, blistering the flesh, leaving sores that wept pus. The condemned coughed and choked, each gasp pulling more filth into their lungs. And Rome left them there. The cloaca was not a quick execution. It was a lingering suffocation, a slow poisoning. Prisoners vomited until their stomachs were empty, then wretched until blood dripped from their mouths. Their eyes stung until they swelled shut, their throats raw from coughing. The filth seeped into wounds, carrying infection faster than any blade could. Within days, flesh peeled from their bones, eaten away by maggots that thrived in the dark. Flies nested in open sores, laying eggs in living flesh. The darkness was total. The prisoners' screams echoed down the tunnels, muffled by stone, unheard by anyone but the rats that came in swarms, gnawing on toes and fingers softened by decay. Some gnawed at the face itself, burrowing into mouths, as the victim lost the strength to swat them away. This was more than execution. This was degradation. Rome did not simply kill. It wanted its enemies to drown in filth, to become part of the waste they once flushed away. The Cloaca Maxima carried sewage to the Tiber River, and with it the bodies of the condemned, washed into the sea without graves, without rites, without memory. And the elites approved. For senators and magistrates who ordered such punishments, there was satisfaction in knowing that traitors were not given the dignity of bloodshed or fire. Their deaths were not noble. They were revolting, fit for vermin. To watch someone hurled from a cliff was to watch a body smashed. To imagine someone chained in the sewers was to imagine them erased, turned into nothing more than sludge. The spectacle was hidden from the eyes of the public, but that did not lessen its impact. Rumors spread through the city, whispers of men thrown alive into the sewers, of their screams echoing beneath the streets, of rats fattened on human flesh. The people laughed, nervously, gagged, and shook their heads, but they remembered. Rome used disgust as a weapon. And it was not only the cloaca. Across the empire, cesspits and latrines were used as places of punishment. In provincial towns, condemned criminals were sometimes lowered into pits of excrement and left to suffocate. The ammonia seared their lungs, the filth climbed their bodies inch by inch, until their heads disappeared beneath the surface. Witnesses spoke of bubbles rising long after the screams had stopped. The horror of these deaths lay not only in pain, but in the stripping away of humanity. To be chained in sewage was to be told that you were waste. Rome turned people into filth before it killed them. And yet, as grotesque as this was, there was worse to come, because some punishments weren't meant to suffocate you slowly. Some weren't hidden in sewers. They were staged in broad daylight, turned into theater, designed to make the crowd laugh even as the victim bled. Rome's cruelty was not only about disgust, it was about spectacle. If the Cloaca Maxima erased its victims in silence, the next punishments mocked them in front of thousands. They became actors in plays where the ending was always death, their suffering a punchline, their humiliation entertainment for senators and plebeians alike. Rome fed its appetite for cruelty not just in sewers, but in theaters. And what came next turned execution into comedy, where myth and flesh met in grotesque performance. The amphitheater, vast and echoing, the crowd packed tight beneath the Sunday incense drifts in the air, meant to mask the stench of animals and sweat. The herald announces the play, the tragic love of Dido and Aeneas. The actors step forward, clad in costumes of silk and paint, but one of them is no actor at all. She is a condemned woman, dragged from a cell, stripped of her own name, clothed instead in the role of a queen. She is Dido now. A crown of cheap gold pressed to her head, robes hanging loose across her trembling body. The crowd laughs, already anticipating the ending. In the myth, Dido takes her own life when abandoned by her lover. In the play, the condemned woman will do the same, but here, the dagger is no prop. At first, the performance feels like theater, the speeches, the gestures, the drama. But when the moment comes, the herald hands her a blade sharpened to a gleaming point. Her hands shake. The crowd leans forward, she hesitates, and the soldiers shove her. The knife pierces her chest. Her scream carries across the amphitheater, raw and unplanned. Blood spreads across her robe. The smell of iron fills the air, mixing with incense. The crowd roars in approval, satisfied not with art but with death disguised as art. And this was only one play. Other myths were staged with similar cruelty. Prisoners made to play Orpheus were dragged into the arena with a lyre in their hands, only to be torn apart by bears when the performance ended. Those playing Hercules were handed torches, set aflame, and made to stagger about the stage while the audience laughed at their heroic death. The Romans delighted in the trickery. Props that looked like stage weapons were replaced with real ones. A papier-mâché sword swapped for iron. A wax candle swapped for flaming pitch. A stage pyre that was no longer an illusion but a roaring inferno. The condemned never knew until the moment arrived. Their fear, their confusion, their realization that this was no play at all, that was the entertainment. And the disgust went deeper. Animals were used as actors too, loosed into the arena mid-play. Women playing Pasiphae were mocked as they were bound and presented before bulls. Men cast as Marsyas were flayed alive to mimic the satyr's punishment by Apollo. The stage became a slaughterhouse, the line between myth and reality blurred by screams. The crowd loved it. Senators and plebeians alike leaned forward, laughing and jeering. For the elites, this was not just entertainment, it was reassurance. Watching these performances reminded them that they held the power of life and death, that even myths bent to their authority. To turn theater into execution was to remind Rome itself that dignity was fragile, and that Rome could strip it away whenever it wished. And the irony was bitter. Rome celebrated its theater, its poets, its myths. But in the amphitheater, art was corrupted into cruelty. The plays no longer elevated. They degraded. They mocked. They turned tragedy into comedy, and comedy into blood. For the condemned, there was no applause, only laughter as their bodies collapsed, burned, torn or broken. The smell of burning flesh mingled with the smoke of incense. The cries of the dying mixed with the cheers of the crowd. For Rome, there was no contradiction. This was justice as theater. This was punishment as entertainment. But if theater mocked dignity, other punishments tore the body apart in ways designed to horrify. Rome did not always hide behind myths or plays. Sometimes, it revealed cruelty plainly, without masks, without irony. Because when the condemned were hung upside down, spread wide, and sawn apart from groin to skull, there was no story, no stagecraft, no disguise. There was only gore. Imagine this: a prisoner dragged into the forum, stripped, beaten, and forced to the scaffold. The crowd is quieter now than at a play or beast hunt. They know what's coming. They have seen it before, and though it sickens even hardened men, they cannot look away. The condemned is bound by the ankles and hauled upward, suspended upside down from a wooden frame. His legs are pulled apart, spread wide, leaving him hanging like a butchered carcass. The air is hot. The sun beats down. The prisoner thrashes, blood rushing to his head until his face swells purple. This is no accident. It is deliberate. Hanging him upside down keeps the blood flowing to his brain, prolonging consciousness, ensuring he feels every moment of what follows. The soldiers step forward, hefting a long saw, its teeth sharpened, glinting in the light. The crowd leans in. The first touch of iron against flesh sends a shudder through the prisoner. The saw bites into his groin, tearing through soft flesh, then grates against bone. His scream pierces the air, high and ragged. The sound echoes against marble walls, rising above the murmurs of the crowd. Blood spills downward, spraying as the teeth grind deeper. It is slow work. The saw is heavy, meant for timber, not flesh. 2 men grasp it, pulling back and forth, the teeth gnawing their way through muscle, sinew, and bone. Each pull sends a spray of blood and a hiss of sawdust-like fragments, bone ground to powder, floating into the air. The smell is unbearable. Hot iron, blood, and the acrid stench of urine released in terror. The condemned writhes, but the ropes hold tight. His screams grow hoarse, then break into sobs, then return again as the saw carves upward. The blood pooling in his head keeps him awake far longer than nature intended. He feels it all, every vibration of the saw against his bones, every tug of flesh ripped apart, every nerve screaming. The crowd watches in grim silence, punctuated by gasps and muttered prayers. Some cover their mouths, others turn away, but most remain, transfixed. Rome did not shield its citizens from horror. It invited them to witness, to remember what awaited anyone who betrayed the empire. The act was not just execution, it was warning. The message carved into flesh and bone was clear: rebellion ends in pieces. And what happened after was worse. The saw did not always finish its work in one session. If exhaustion overtook the executioners, or if Rome wanted to prolong the spectacle, the victim was left hanging, half sawn, his body dangling in ruin. Sometimes he lingered for hours, even days, consciousness flickering in and out, until the saw returned to finish its grim path upward. Witnesses wrote of bodies split in two, the halves falling apart like butchered livestock, the organs spilling onto the stones. The crowd recoiled, but they did not forget. The horror lingered in memory, carried in whispers down alleys and across markets. And still, Rome justified it. Senators declared such punishments necessary for deserters, whose betrayal could cost legions their lives. Priests declared it fitting for rebels who had defied the gods of the city. The brutality was wrapped in law, but the reality was naked cruelty. The irony stung. Rome boasted of discipline, order, civilization. Yet its justice relied on saws meant for wood, grinding through flesh while citizens looked on. It was solemn brutality masquerading as law. The The spectacle satisfied something darker in Rome's elites. To watch a man sawn apart was to revel in absolute power. It reminded senators and generals that they too could reduce anyone to silence with a word. The suffering was not incidental. It was the point. To make men scream until their throats bled was to remind the crowd of Rome's reach and to remind the ruling class of their own supremacy. The punishment lingered in Roman imagination long after the screams had faded. Writers invoked sawing not only as history, but as metaphor, proof of Rome's capacity for cruelty. To the condemned, there was no metaphor. Only the teeth of the saw, the rush of blood to the skull, the taste of iron in the air. But as horrifying as sawing was, Rome's strangest cruelty didn't just cut people open. Sometimes it did the opposite, sewing them in, alive, with beasts. Because Rome reserved a punishment stranger still for those guilty of the most unforgivable crime of all, parricide. For them, the empire prepared not a cross, not a pyre, not even a saw. It prepared a sack, stitched tight, writhing with animals, in which man and beast alike would suffocate in filth and fear. The condemned stands in the forum, stripped of clothing, bound tightly with cords. The crowd gathers in tense anticipation. For once, there will be no cross, no pyre, no sword. Instead, a leather sack is dragged into view, heavy and reeking. At first glance, it looks like a fisherman's catch brought in from the Tiber, but this sack is alive. It writhes, it hisses, it screeches. Because inside it are animals, chosen to embody chaos, fear, and filth. The ritual begins. A dog, snapping and foaming at the mouth, is shoved into the sack. A rooster flutters madly, its claws raking at the air. A monkey, shrieking in panic, thrashes violently against the leather walls. Finally, a serpent is dropped in, its body coiling and striking blindly in the confined dark. The crowd shudders at the sounds. The sack twists and bucks on the ground, the animals already tearing at one another. Then the condemned is dragged forward. His eyes widen, his body convulses against the ropes, but there is no escape. He is shoved headfirst into the sack, forced down among fur, feathers, scales, and claws. His muffled scream bursts out the moment the leather mouth is stitched shut. The executioners work quickly, binding it tight, sealing man and beast together in a single suffocating chamber. What follows is chaos. The sack thrashes on the stones, leaping and rolling as man and animals claw at one another in blind terror. The dog bites, its teeth sinking into flesh. The monkey shrieks, tearing at hair and skin. The snake coils tighter, its fangs striking. The rooster's wings beat frantically in the dark, its claws slashing. Inside, the condemned flails helplessly, his muffled cries echoing through the leather. The heat builds quickly. Breath turns the air hot and wet. Urine seeps across the floor of the sack, mixing with sweat and blood. The stench is overpowering, sour and animal. The condemned gasps for air, sucking in the foul vapor, choking on feathers, fur, and the stink of reptile musk. The crowd cannot see the details, but they hear them. The muffled shrieks, the growls, the screeches. They watch the leather bulge and twist as bodies slam against one another. Some laugh nervously, others gag, others stare with horrified fascination. This is Rome at its most absurd, execution as grotesque theater, where the condemned is not simply killed but degraded into a spectacle of chaos. And when the sack grows still, the ritual is not yet complete. The leather bundle, heavy with its mingled cargo of man and beast, is lifted and dragged toward the river. The executioners grunt, heaving it onto a cart, then down the embankment to the Tiber. With a final heave, they cast it into the water. The sack splashes, bobs once, then sinks beneath the surface, bubbles rising as the last traces of life vanish. No grave, no rites, no memory. The condemned is erased, swallowed by river and beast alike. His body never sees daylight again. Rome loved this punishment because it was symbolic. To kill one's parents was to reject the natural order, to rebel against the family, the state, the gods themselves. To be sown into a sack with animals was to be cast out of humanity entirely, reduced to filth and chaos. It was not only death, it was degradation, and there was an element of bitter comedy in it. Senators laughed at the absurdity of a man stuffed in a bag with a rooster and monkey. The grotesque mixture of creatures was a parody of order, a living caricature of the condemned's crime. For the elites, it was entertainment as much as justice. But for the victim, it was hell. Imagine the last sensations: claws raking flesh, teeth tearing muscle, snake fangs piercing skin. Imagine the choking heat, the stink of feathers, the crush of bodies in darkness. Imagine your lungs screaming for air as water seeped in, filling the sack, turning it from chamber to coffin. And Rome was proud of this, proud of a punishment so bizarre that even other cultures struggled to comprehend it, proud of a justice that erased not only life but dignity. But Rome didn't always need animals to degrade you. Sometimes it found simpler ways, humiliation staged in the open, designed to strip away dignity while the crowd laughed. Punishments where the condemned were not sewn into sacks, but smeared in filth, where the pain was less physical and more public, more humiliating, more revolting. Because after Pointe Colle, there came punishments that did not need claws or fangs to horrify. They needed only Rome's own appetite for mockery. Imagine the Forum on a hot afternoon. The crowd gathers, buzzing with anticipation. There will be no swords today, no crosses, no pyres. Instead, the condemned are dragged forward, naked, their bodies smeared in dung scooped from the gutters. The smell hits first, acrid, sour, overpowering, forcing even spectators to gag as they cover their mouths. The prisoners are paraded slowly, forced to crawl on hands and knees through the marketplace, their skins streaked with filth, their faces pressed against the dust. The crowd jeers, delighted by the spectacle. Rotten food rains down, moldy bread, half-eaten fruit, scraps of meat turned green with rot. The missiles splatter against bare backs, slide down shoulders, cling to tangled hair. The condemned flinch, but they cannot shield themselves. Soldiers prod them forward with sticks, laughing as the prisoners stumble. And the degradation goes further. Men in the crowd step forward to spit. Thick gobs of phlegm land on faces, dripping down chins, mixing with dung until the condemned are masked in filth. Some urinate openly, streams running down the prisoners' backs as the crowd howls with laughter. Children join in, hurling stones, shouting insults, mocking their cries. The condemned are forced to perform humiliating acts. Some are made to lick the dirt from the stones. Others are forced to lap at puddles of foul water until they vomit. Witnesses record punishments where adulterers were dragged through markets and made to drink bowls of liquid so foul, a mix of vinegar, bile, and sewage, that their stomachs twisted in violent retching. The laughter grows louder as the condemned choke and cough. Rome's justice here was not about ending life, but about ending dignity. A thief might live through the ordeal, but he would never raise his head in pride again. An adulteress might return home, but she returned marked by humiliation so deep it clung to her like the stench of the filth she had swallowed. And this was the point. Rome understood that public shame was its own weapon. To make a man die was simple. To make him live in disgrace, scorned by neighbors, whispered about in markets, mocked by children, that was a punishment Rome found even more satisfying. The absurdity of it was part of the cruelty. Senators in spotless togas laughed as naked men crawled past, smeared in dung. Priests who preached of virtue turned their eyes into spectators' seats. The line between justice and entertainment blurred until it vanished entirely. And what happened after was often worse than the punishment itself. The condemned became marked people, their reputations rotting like the food hurled at them. They carried the smell of shame in every conversation, every glance from a neighbor, every whispered reminder that they had once licked filth before the eyes of the empire. Rome's justice was layered. Some punishments killed the body, some killed the memory. These killed the soul, turning men and women into walking symbols of disgrace. But some punishments weren't about filth on the skin. Some went deeper. Instead of smearing a body in dung, Rome chose to bury it in stone. Instead of laughter, the punishment was silence. Instead of mockery, it was ritual. Because when a Vestal virgin broke her vow of chastity, she was not paraded in filth. She was led into darkness, sealed beneath the earth, and left to die slowly, stone by stone, candle by candle, breath by breath. A young Vestal, perhaps no older than 20, is led from the house of the Vestals, her white robes torn and stained. She has served faithfully, tending the eternal flame of Vesta, believed to protect Rome itself. But she has been accused, rightly or wrongly, of betraying her vow. And for that, the Senate has decreed her death. She is paraded through the forum, not smeared in dung like a thief, not mocked like an adulteress. The crowd is silent. To see a Vestal condemned is to see Rome itself on trial. Heads bow, not in pity, but in dread. For if a Vestal is defiled, the gods themselves may turn against the city. The procession leads to the Campus Sceleratus, the field of wickedness, just outside the city walls. There, a pit has been dug. Steps descend into a narrow underground chamber. Inside the chamber are the barest tokens of life: a small jug of water, a loaf of bread, a lamp flickering weakly in the darkness. Rome cannot spill a Vestal's blood that would profane her sacred body. So it creates the illusion of mercy. She is given food, water, and light. But everyone knows the truth. The chamber is a tomb. The Vestal is led down the steps. Her ankles tremble. Her hands grip the rough stone. The air is cold, damp, heavy with the scent of earth. She looks back once, but no one meets her eyes. At the threshold, the priest turns away. The soldiers retreat. She is alone. The stone door is lowered. The scraping of rock against rock fills the chamber, each grind closer to silence. Dust rains from the ceiling. Light narrows into a slit, then into a pinprick, then into nothing at all. When the last stone falls into place, there is silence. Rome itself seems to exhale as the entrance is sealed. Inside, the Vestal is swallowed by darkness. The candle flickers, casting shadows against the walls. She takes a sip of water, a bite of bread, but the act feels hollow. The lamp sputters, its flame shrinking as oil burns low. Hours pass, then days. Hunger twists her stomach. Thirst cracks her lips. The candle dies. Darkness presses in, absolute and suffocating. Her breath quickens, echoing in the chamber, until she no longer knows if she hears her own gasps or the ghosts of the women buried before her. The silence is heavier than chains. It is complete, oppressive, eternal. And what happens after is worse. When death finally comes, by hunger, thirst, or despair, her body remains sealed in the earth. No funeral rites, no pyre, no prayers. She rots beneath Rome itself, flesh softening, collapsing into bone, the smell of decay seeping into the soil. The city builds over her grave, walking daily on the bones of its own sacred daughters. This was Rome's solemn horror, a punishment cloaked in ritual, yet dripping with cruelty. The people spoke of divine justice, but what they witnessed was claustrophobic torment. The field of wickedness became a place of whispered dread, its soil cursed by the bodies buried beneath it. The irony is clear. Rome exalted the Vestals as guardians of purity, protectors of the city, honored with privileges no other women enjoyed. Yet when they fell, Rome buried them like vermin, sealing them underground to starve in silence. The same empire that sang of virtue reduced its most sacred women to nameless corpses beneath its feet. And yet, even this wasn't the worst. For as suffocating as the chamber was, as slow as starvation gnawed, it was at least solemn, ritualized, hidden. Rome still pretended dignity, however twisted, but there was a punishment so foul, so revolting, that even hardened legionaries recoiled. A punishment not of silence, but of pure horror. The burial of the vestals was ritualized, solemn, cloaked in silence. But Rome was never content with silence for long. More often, it demanded noise, jeers, laughter, screams. And among its foulest spectacles was a punishment that blended cruelty with grotesque disgust, execution by entrails, where the condemned were smeared, wrapped, or even forced to choke on animal guts before being hurled to beasts. Picture the amphitheater on a sweltering summer day. The sand is already stained with the blood of gladiators and wild animals, the air buzzing with flies. But today, the crowd is promised something different. The herald announces a punishment, not for entertainment's glory, but for the shame of the condemned. Slaves drag out barrels covered in buzzing insects. When the lids are pried open, the stench rolls across the arena, hot, sour, and putrid. Inside are the intestines of slaughtered oxen and goats, congealed in blood, half-rotting in the sunday. The crowd groans and laughs in equal measure, covering their noses with cloths, while leaning forward to watch. The condemned is dragged into the arena. A thief? A deserter? A criminal of little importance, it hardly matters. He is stripped naked, bound, and thrown to the ground. Soldiers seize handfuls of guts from the barrels and smear them across his skin. The sticky warmth clings to his chest, his arms, his face. Entrails drape across his shoulders like garlands of shame. One soldier shoves a piece of bloody offal into his mouth, gagging him until he vomits across the sand. The crowd howls with laughter. The prisoner staggers upright, but more guts are piled onto him. Flies swarm instantly, buzzing in a frenzy, crawling into his eyes, his nose, his open mouth. The smell is overpowering, bile, rot, and iron. The condemned retches again and again, but there is no relief. The filth clings to him like a second skin. The humiliation is part of the sentence. Romans prized dignity above all, and this punishment stripped it away. A man reduced to a walking carcass, mocked as less than human, treated as nothing more than bait for animals. And then the real execution begins. The gates at the edge of the arena creak open. A lion emerges, its ribs showing through golden fur, its muzzle already stained with blood from earlier kills. The beast pauses, nostrils flaring at the stench of offal smeared across the condemned's body. The prisoner stumbles backward, tripping over entrails dragging in the sand. The crowd rises to its feet, shouting, jeering, demanding the show. The lion leaps. Its claws rake across the prisoner's chest, tearing skin and guts alike. The crowd roars in approval. The condemned screams, muffled through blood and bile. He tries to crawl, but the lion seizes him by the shoulder and drags him across the sand, tearing flesh from bone as it feasts not only on the offal but on the man himself. Sometimes dogs were used instead, packs of them loosed into the arena. They swarmed the condemned, drawn to the stench, tearing the entrails from his body, and then tearing his body itself. Soldiers laughed as the man was buried beneath snarling, snapping jaws, his shrieks drowned by growls and the cheers of the mob. The punishment was more than death. It was parody. The condemned became a grotesque caricature of a gladiator, paraded before the crowd not to fight, but to be mocked, smeared in guts like a feast prepared for beasts. The crowd laughed, gagged, cheered, pointed. Mothers covered their children's eyes but piqued themselves. Senators smiled thinly, reassured of their power. And the disgust lingered long after the victim was gone. When the beasts had finished their feast, the sand was raked, but the stench remained. Blood and bile seeped into the dust, rising again with each footstep. People carried it home on their sandals, the smell of punishment following them into their houses, into their beds, into their dreams. Even hardened legionaries, who had marched through fields of corpses, turned their faces away at times. Blood they could stomach, steel wounds they could ignore. But the sight of a man smeared in rotting entrails, gagging on bile, torn apart while the crowd laughed, that was too much even for soldiers who had seen war. This was the genius and the madness of Roman cruelty. It was not content with killing. It demanded defilement. The condemned were not merely executed. They were made into jokes, into filth, into bait. They were smeared with the guts of animals so that when they died they were not mourned as humans, but consumed as refuse. And that is why this punishment belongs among the foulest Rome ever devised. It weaponized disgust as much as pain. It turned offal, the stinking waste of the slaughterhouse, into an instrument of humiliation. The victim was no longer a man or woman. They were carrion, unworthy of respect, unworthy of memory. Rome remembered itself as a civilization of law, order, and marble grandeur. But under the bright sun of its arenas, in the laughter of its crowds, it revealed another truth. It was also a civilization of filth, cruelty, and mockery. And so this final punishment, execution by entrails, serves as the foulest mirror of Rome itself, an empire that wrapped itself in marble and poetry but stank of rot beneath, an empire that could build aqueducts to carry clean water and then drag prisoners into arenas smeared with blood and bile, an empire that could raise temples to the gods and then laugh as men smeared with entrails were torn apart for sport. This, then, is the final lesson. Rome's justice was not just about law. It was about disgust, humiliation, and the reduction of human beings into refuse. Rome did not simply kill its enemies. It consumed them. It laughed at them. It covered them in filth, fed them to beasts, and erased them from memory. The smell lingers still, across the centuries, rising from the pages of history like rot from the sand of a long-forgotten arena. The story began with a young woman dragged through the forum, her wrists bound, her clothes torn, her body hurled from the Tarpeian rock. But she was not alone. She was one of thousands, men, women, children, who were ground beneath Rome's law, not only in body but in dignity. Rome is remembered in marble. Its arches, its columns, its aqueducts stretching like veins across the empire. It is remembered in words, Cicero's speeches, Virgil's poetry, Seneca's stoicism. But beneath the marble and the rhetoric lay something darker. Rome's justice system was not only about order, it was about control through disgust. It took men and women and turned them into refuse, into spectacle, into symbols of degradation. The Tarpeian rock hurled traitors into heaps of shattered bone, their bodies left for dogs and birds. The sewers drowned men in waste, erasing them in the city's own filth. The amphitheaters mocked myth by making death into theater, stripping stories of dignity and draping them in blood. Rebels were sawn apart, bone dust in the air, their screams echoing against marble walls. Parricides were sewn into sacks with beasts, a grotesque parody of justice. Adulterers and thieves crawled naked through markets, smeared in dung, spat upon until their souls broke. Vestal virgins were buried alive, their silence haunting the soil beneath Rome. And at last, the cloaca swallowed men whole, erasing not only their lives but their very memory. Each punishment was more than death. It was performance, a theater of cruelty where the audience was Rome itself. Senators in spotless togas, plebeians clutching their children, soldiers standing guard. All complicit, all witnesses, all participants in a culture that demanded not only that justice be done, but that it be seen, smelt, and remembered in disgust. This was how Rome ruled. Law was not just parchment and decree. Law was spectacle, Law was humiliation. Law was filth. The condemned did not simply die. They were defiled. Their bodies were broken, their names erased, their memory smeared in sewage, dung, and rot. It worked. Fear spread faster than armies. Rumors of sawing, of sacks filled with beasts, of sewers swallowing men, these kept citizens obedient. These kept slaves from rebellion, soldiers from desertion, daughters from straying. Rome's greatest weapon was not always the legion's sword. Sometimes it was the stench of its justice. And yet, there is an irony that will not fade. The empire built on law, law that still shapes ours today, was also built on cruelty. Senators spoke of virtue while laughing at naked men smeared in filth. Poets wrote of eternal Rome while dogs gnawed the bones of the fallen beneath their windows. Philosophers spoke of reason while the cloaca carried human bodies into the sea. Rome's legacy is double-edged. We inherit its architecture, its laws, its language, but we also inherit the memory of its punishments, its revolting spectacles, its theater of filth. Think again of the young woman hurled from the Tarpeian rock. Her body broke on the stones. Dogs tore at her flesh. Birds plucked at her bones. She was not simply killed. She was consumed by animals, by spectacle, by Rome itself. And this was Rome's truth. The empire did not simply punish. It defiled. It made death filthy, shameful, revolting. It blurred the line between justice and mockery, between law and cruelty. In doing so, it carved its power not only into stone monuments, but into the broken bodies of its victims. Rome did not simply rule, it consumed, and centuries later, its shadow has not washed away. If this glimpse into history's hidden darkness has left you wanting to uncover more buried truths, I've prepared another journey into the shadows of the past that you won't want to miss. Click on the video appearing on your screen now to discover another shocking chapter that history tried to erase, and if you found this exploration as compelling as I did, hit that subscribe button so we can continue peeling back the layers of history together. These forgotten voices deserve to be heard, and there are so many more stories waiting to be told.